Okay, so today we're talking about counseling couples and sexuality. And some of you know me. I'm Dr. Tammy Nelson, and my books are What's Eating You, which is my first book, which some of you don't know, which I really came to understand hunger in a different way. And we'll talk about what that means in terms of the desire for pleasure and a desire for feeling of fulfillment or a desire for feeling of satiation and what we've discovered about that. And then I wrote Getting the Sex You Want, which is integrating good couples therapy using imago relationship therapy with sex and getting the sex that couples want and using the dialogue skills of imago therapy. We're going to use dialogue today. I like imago therapy because I think it creates a container and a space for couples to mirror each other without having to put pressure on each other to change. Because realistically, people don't want to change. They want their situations to change. And when people come into therapy or counseling, they're really asking you to change their partner. They don't want to change. And they do desperately want their situations to change. They're under the illusion that if you change their partner, then their situations will change. It's not necessarily what happens. And so we'll work on how do you change that idea that people have around how their situations can change for them and how you can empower them to have that locus of control shift from you back to the client, and how people can shift from giving the power away to their partner to change things and owning the power themselves to at least take responsibility for what they're putting into the relationship and to take responsibility for what they're putting into the space. So I'm also going to challenge you to think about what you're putting into the space today, whether you're listening at home or whether you're in a classroom or whether you're in your own partnership at home, to think about what is it that you're putting into your own space today. Is it toxic? Is it helpful? Is it connecting? Is it disconnecting? Are you creating space to make yourself feel comfortable? Are you shutting down to protect yourself? What are you consciously or unconsciously putting into the space? So we'll use this as a metaphor, this space right here, and we'll see what it feels like at the end of the day. And then I wrote The New Monogamy, which is about redefining your relationship after infidelity. So we look at infidelity like a trauma to the space, a trauma to that erotic space, to the erotic connection in a couple, and how you can rewrite and re-begin and reboot a relationship even after it's been traumatized. And then I wrote When You're the One Who Cheats, for the partner who supposedly is the perpetrator. Because if we're always looking at trauma from the victim place, then we have a whole world of victimology where we're constantly in that place of being victimized. You're hurting me. What you're saying is creating a space that I feel like I have to defend myself perpetually and put you in that place of being the one that's hurting me. And frankly, now in our culture of therapy, we have a lot of that language around victim. And I think we need to change that. If we're going to change the dynamic of people being hurt, we need to not just focus on the people who've been hurt, but the people who are doing the hurting and figure out why that's happening. You know, if you're going to change people who are doing abusing, you need to figure out why they're abusing, not just focus on the person who's being abused. If you're going to change people who pollute, you can't just look at the pollution. You have to look at why people are dismissive about polluting. Why aren't they recycling? So we have to look at things from a different perspective. So there's a new book coming out in March called Integrative Sex and Couples Therapy. And I have 10 different authors who are writing different chapters about different types of couples therapy, which we're going to talk about today, and how they integrate with sex therapy and sexuality counseling. And we'll talk about the different types of couples therapy today and how they work and how they don't work. Some of them don't work. You can always contact me on Instagram and Twitter if you write nice things. And you can tweet things from this class always. And I would love to contact you on social media now that I know how to do it. And this whole course is a CE course, so you are eligible for CEs towards your Certified Sex and Couples Therapy designation. You can get that through ISTItraining.com. That's Integrative Sex Therapy Institute, ISTItraining.com, ISTItraining.com. And I want to just run this by you first. This is a disclosure that the language in this course sometimes, particularly when we talk about cases, if I show you a video, there might be swear words in it. So just take care of yourself if that's offensive to you. If we use or don't ask about your pronouns, it's unintentional and not meant to offend. Questions that you ask me should be clinically focused, not necessarily personal. It's totally up to you how much you disclose about your personal life, but know that this is not a group therapy. It is meant to be clinically focused. And this is really a course about sex. So if for any reason you feel upset, quote unquote, triggered, which just means that you have a rush of feelings that is probably related to something other than what's happening right now in this moment, then you're allowed to take care of yourself, get up, walk around, go outside, call a friend, but take care of yourself because it's assumed that you're adults and you're going to be taking care of yourself. So what I mean by your pronouns is exactly that. What you prefer to be referred to by. And what I mean by that is not necessarily even a preference. It's what you want people to reference you as. So my pronouns are she, her, and hers. She, her, and hers. If you have pronouns that you want people to use, please tell them. And as we continue in this course, I want you to know where I'm coming from theoretically and also clinically, and the basis of all sexuality counseling and sex therapy, and where I think it's super important for you as clinicians, coaches, counselors, educators to find the basis of all the work that you do is to understand that there really is no normal when it comes to sexuality. That when people come to see you, when you are their counselor or their therapist or their educator or their coach, they're looking to you to be the arbiter of normal. They're looking to you because they think that whatever kind of sex you're having, that's normal, and they don't think they are. Or they think they are, but their partner isn't. And they want you to fix them. Because the kind of sex they want is what they think is in the range of normal, and their partner should come on board. And you should just convince them. And they also want to know where the edge of normal is. And so they want to know, how much sex are you having? What kind of sex are you having? Don't you have that kind of sex with your partner? And how kinky are you? And how often do you have it? And how much desire do you have? And what makes a sexless marriage? And how aroused do you get? And do you have pain during sex? And all the things that they're going through, they want to know, am I normal? That's what they all want to know. That's the thing that people are struggling with when they're sitting with you. Am I normal? And even if they're not asking it, that's the basis of all of their questions. Am I normal? And so they're looking to you to mirror that question and to answer that for them. And you can't. Because there is no book that says this is normal sex. Because there's no such thing. Like I say, normal is a setting on the washing machine. It really means nothing. Because you are seeing their sexuality through your lens. Your lens of sexuality is your experience. So your experience of sex is either kinkier than theirs or less kinky, more vanilla, we say. You're having less sex or more sex. And so you're judging their sexuality through your own personal experience, through your childhood experience, through your religion, your culture, through your view of what gender roles should be. And so you're judging them, perhaps harshly, perhaps open-mindedly. It really depends on your own experience. So there is no normal, there is no rating system when it comes to sex. What you want to be able to do is hold the space for people to figure out what works for them. And to move people from guilt and shame to pleasure. So sort of like what you were saying before, moving people out of trauma into pleasure. Moving people from a performance mode where there's a rating system. If you can get to the finish line, then you're successful. And if you can't, then you're failing. Instead of performance, we want to move people into what gives you pleasure, what's pleasurable for you, what's pleasurable for your partner, and in and of itself, that is quote unquote successful. But we want to even move out of the word success, right, and move away from that. So there really is no normal. So we are really helping people find their sexual identity, not in an orientation way, not in a who am I, as far as who am I attracted to, but in their conceptual idea of what gives them pleasure and who they are in the world. So when we went around and people identified what they did for work, where they live, who they are as a therapist, you take on a role and you assume an identity in the world. I'm a married person, I'm a single person, I'm a student, I'm a doctor, I'm an author, I'm a counselor, I'm a therapist, I'm a mother. All of those things are roles. When we get underneath those roles, sometimes there's other things there as well. So we're going to do a quick exercise. I want you to take out a piece of paper or something to write with. And 20 times, I want you to finish this sentence stem. I am. And don't just list 20 things. I want you to write I am 20 times. And the first thing that comes to your mind, just off the top of your head, I am something, I am something, I'm something, I am something, I'm something. 20 times. Go. So find someone in the room, could be someone sitting next to you, and read your list. If you feel comfortable, if you don't want to share, it's fine. You can just be a listener. But you're going to read it off like I am a therapist, I am a listener, I am beautiful, I am bitchy, I am tired, I am, okay? And so you'll find it sort of reads like a poem. There'll be one threesome. Okay, go. Nice job. Let's give everybody a round of applause there. And you can go back to your seats. So I want you to notice in your list, when you look at your list, when you wrote I am a, is that a role that you play? Or is that who you really are? And then look at the first few that you wrote. Are those things that other people told you that you are? And as you went further down the list, are those things that you know about yourself? Where are the roles? Where are the assigned roles? Where are the things that you are learning about yourself more recently? Where are the things that you are growing into and that are a little bit more vulnerable as you say them? You can hear people read their voices crack a little because they really are who they are, and it has more meaning. Not that the other things don't have meaning, but usually the first few things are things it's easier to say. Maybe you say them more often, or other people know these things about you. And the things that we know about ourselves and the things other people know about us are easier to say out loud. The things that people don't know about us, that we keep closer to our heart, that are more personal about us, may also hold clues to what we don't know about ourselves. And as we continue to look inward and learn about ourselves, more of who we are and who we want to be and our potential rises to the surface, which is what good counseling should be. It should be the place that we go to that holds the space so that more of us can be revealed. So that we have a container where more of our roles can be peeled off and who we are trying to be can rise to the surface. And we can try that on. And whether it's individual counseling or group counseling or couples counseling, we can play with that role and see, is this really me? Is this who I want to be? Is this who I've been told to be? Is this a projection? Is this about my parents? Is this who my partner is trying to make me be? Is this how other people perceive me in groups? You know, group therapy is really just a microcosm of life, and who you are in group is who you are in life. And a good group therapy is really just a reenactment or a recreation of who you are in your day-to-day life. It shouldn't be individual counseling with each person. It should be just a confrontation of how you are in your world so that you can see and let rise to the surface how you interact with other people. It's why being a group counselor is so hard, because you really have to let people be themselves and then mirror that back to them. It's brutal. So let's talk about the different kinds of counseling. There's individual counseling, right? So that you're sitting with another person one-on-one. And then there's sexuality counseling, which is many times the same. And relationship counseling, which is many times sexuality counseling as well. Family counseling and group counseling. So you may have other shades of gray in between there. But when we talk about counseling, those are the areas. Now, when you're taught counseling in college or graduate school, they usually don't include sexuality counseling, right? I mean, some of you have had like 10 minutes of counseling maybe in grad school, or even in an MFT program, they don't really talk about sex. You maybe have one class. One.
I'm currently teaching in a graduate program, and I talk about sex all the time to my students' delight, but it's nowhere else.
It's not in the curriculum.
Not at all.
No. Do they have it in your doctoral program?
But I think it's only like 2 classes.
Yeah. And that's probably new. Because they didn't have that 5 years ago. Yeah.
They didn't mention it in seminary in all the 3 years of spiritual counseling classes.
Never.
Never.
Talk about repression.
Just in the context of
3
religion,
years,
like,
you said?
3 years, yeah, like how the Hindus, like we
3 years of seminary.
just nothing about it.
Nothing.
In terms of helping people
Yeah.
with that issue.
Well, even in my postgraduate courses, like in marriage and family therapy, different kinds of couples counseling, never talked about sex, because the idea was that if you fix the relationship, the sex will fix itself. And what I know, is that if you fix your sex life, if you work on your sex life, many things in your relationship will work themselves out. So, because people want a connected, passionate, alive relationship. And so a lot of the conflict of an everyday companionship is resolved when people feel passionate and alive and connected and intimate. And the two parts of a relationship, the companionship and the eroticism, are truly two parts of a relationship. There is the day-to-day roommate life of a relationship, and then there's the eroticism, the eros. And when you work on the eros and you work on the sexuality, a lot of the companionship stuff works itself out. But in traditional counseling programs, all of the focus is on the companionship issues. Communication is about companionship. Holding the space is about the companionship. The homework assignments are about the companionship. Everything is about how to create change in the day-to-day life, which I'm not saying you shouldn't do, but if you create change in your sex life, it has a waterfall effect, not just a ripple effect, but a waterfall effect on the rest of the companionship. So the stages of counseling, we know, and you probably know this already, that one, you create some kind of safety, right? You can't start a sexuality counseling session or be with a client and say, "Hi, nice to meet you. So tell me all the deep, dark secrets about your sex life. I want to know everything. I want to know what kink you're into, and I want to know what positions you like, and tell me your deepest sexual fantasies." And yet a lot of sexuality counselors will do that, or a lot of people just starting off will assume that people will want to tell them that. But if you think about me just coming up to you and saying, "Hi, nice to meet you. So what kind of sex do you like?" You would be horribly offended. And people who do counseling many times don't ask about sex for just that reason, because they feel the social awkwardness of asking a stranger about their sex life. And yet, it is true that if you ask people, "When was the last time you had sex and how was it?" it creates an instant permission slip for people to talk about their intimate life. So now they know that you're that person that they can finally talk about what's really important and not just their roommate life. So, in fact, creating that safety, trust, and that rapport includes the question, "When was the last time you had sex and how was it?" It includes what seems counterintuitive, to ask about the most personal, private aspect of their life. What might be offensive to the guy on the street. So when you go to Starbucks and have coffee, "Hey, thanks, love your hat with the little jingle bells on it. And how's your sex life, by the way?" I mean, that seems kind of offensive. And yet, when someone sits down within 5 minutes of meeting them, that's exactly what you're going to do. "Hey, nice jacket. And by the way, how's your sex life?" And that does create a level of trust. Now, there are other ways to establish trust in a counseling relationship. But until you have that established container, you really can't do any kind of insight work or depth work, or you can't really create any change. Because as much as you think that people are coming to counseling to change their lives or change themselves, it's really, really unusual that people are going to dramatically change in counseling. It's really unusual for people to dramatically shift their lives and shift the way that they function in counseling because of two things. One, that most counseling is purely cognitive. So you could say the most brilliant things in a session, which I'm sure you would, and people can have amazing insights, awaken to things that they never thought about before, make connections to their childhood, sort of realize what they're doing, recognize their behaviors, see the light, have those moments of like connection and awe at your brilliant statements, see how they're messing up their lives, and then they get up and move their body, go back into their life, and repeat the same behavioral movements that they do every day. And once they're in their somatic habits, it doesn't matter what they thought. They come back the following week and they're doing the exact same thing, and you think, what happened? We had such a good session. What do you mean you're doing drugs again? I thought I cured you. You were so cured last week. What do you mean you're doing the same thing you've always done? And they say to you, yeah, I don't know. I don't get it either. I thought, I must need a new therapist. I must need a new husband. I must need to quit my job. I'm not really clear either. It's not working for me. But the reality is people need to change not just their thoughts, but they need to change their behavior, and they need to change something in their body during the session or very close to the session in order for it to make sense and to sink in. It's kind of like if you are depressed and you're going to counseling and you do great cognitive work and even do some behavioral work, but you're still eating sugar. You go home and you drink coffee and you pour 17 sugars in your coffee and you eat a big box of donuts, and then you go back to therapy 2 days later and you're like, I don't know why I'm still depressed. Can't figure it out. If you don't make those somatic changes in your body, something is not going to change. If you are anxious and you go to therapy and you make this amazing connection, well, of course I'm anxious. I grew up with a mother that followed me around constantly. What are you doing? Why are you touching that? Where are you going? How come you're doing that? Don't touch that. The world is a dangerous place. Where are you going? Stay with me. Stay home. Stay on my lap. Don't go anywhere. And you become anxiously attached, and the world is a dangerous place. And you awaken to this memory of what it was like to be that child. And you are so happy with your therapist, and you're like, oh my God, that counseling session was amazing. And then you go home and you go into your apartment and you lock the 17 locks on your door, and you close all your blinds, and you put the wood shutters over your windows, and you put all the passwords on your computer, and you put the tinfoil over your head, and you continue to do all the behavioral, somatic things in your body to protect yourself, you will still feel the same level of anxiety. So we know that insight and change has to happen both psychologically and physically. It has to happen physically in your body. Something has to change. And then the third phase is the closure. It's the integration. It has to make sense in the rest of your life. So not only do you have to change something physically, but you have to, for long-term healing, you have to integrate this into your sex life. So sexuality counseling means something has to change. Even if you're not in a relationship, you can integrate sexuality counseling into your own self-pleasure routine, or something has to change somehow. So we'll talk about how to do that. And so there's additional stages in here. It's not just those three. Those are the three major phases of counseling, but you also need to do some kind of assessment. People ask all the time, do I need to do a specific sex history with each of my clients? And there's mixed reviews on this. If you sit down with a new client and take a detailed sex history about their background of every single time they had sex, the first time they had sex, the second time they had sex, and what their sex life is like now, sometimes that doesn't create trust and rapport. It creates distance. It intellectualizes their experience. And if you do it before you have trust and rapport, many times you won't get the whole story anyway. So if someone's been sexually abused or they have a trauma background, they're not going to tell you necessarily in the first session anyway. So you can do a thorough history and you're not going to get the whole story. I don't do a big sex history with people. I ask, when was the last time you had sex and how was it? Because what's more important to me is what's happening now. Throughout the counseling sessions or throughout the therapy, I'll find out and start to ask questions about the past. Because in a sex history or sex assessment is really about the past. And good counseling, good therapy is about what's happening now. You can get all the information you need about now. Now, I'm going to contradict myself a little bit later when we talk about object relations and how to find out how people are connecting and relating as a result of their early object relations, their early attachments, their early parental figures. But for now, it's the first session. You're in my office. I just want to know what's going on now in your life because that will tell me everything. How you're having sex now tells me everything about your life. And what's also important is identifying your strengths and your challenges and what tools you have. So what are you good at? Are you a good writer? Are you really good at work? Are you really good at sports? How are you getting through your life now? Because your survival skills are also the things that are holding you back. They're also the challenges in your life. The way that you've survived your whole life are probably brilliant from your childhood. It was a great way to get through your childhood and survive growing up. It's probably not working today in your primary relationships. So as much as this is like probably your strongest skill set, it's probably also messing with your life. So I want to know what those things are. Like a couple of you said, I work a lot. A couple of you are a little overachieving. I mean, I'm just joking with you because I can relate to that. Like I really love my work and my career and the mission that I have in my life, but it also is a little compulsive sometimes. And for me, I'm just saying.
It's an identity, right? And it's a great defense mechanism. Yeah. Instead, I'll work 90 hours this week.
90 hours. Yeah. It's a way to bypass, for me, what was a childhood. I grew up really poor in my childhood. So part of it is driven by fear of not having money. And I got to make some money. I'm in a panic all the time about money. It doesn't matter how much money I make. It doesn't matter if I'm broke and bouncing checks or if I make a ton of money. Because even if I make a ton of money, then I owe the IRS a ton of money. So I got to make more money. So it doesn't matter. I constantly still feel like I'm on the edge all the time, perpetually. And so it's a compensation for childhood. And it's also my dharma. I feel like it's a mission that I have to do. So it's also the thing that gives me pleasure. And I love the work that I do, and it's what I have to do in the world, and it gives me joy. So it's a strength and it's a challenge. And so my counseling would be around finding that balance. How do you find the balance to do something with joy and love and using the skill set without that monkey on my back that's going, you're not doing enough, don't, panic. Without the panic and anxiety that chased me from my childhood. I'm working on it. And then the other stage of counseling that we can really do well or not well is termination. And a lot of times we have a struggle with the termination piece of counseling because none of us are good at endings. We kind of suck at them. We're not good at change, first of all. And a lot of us, not just therapists, just people in general, are not good at transitions. And so transitioning from one phase of a relationship to another is not easy. It's why divorce is so ugly. It's why breakups are so bad. It's why ending therapy is usually the client just stopping therapy. They just stop coming. Or they just fade away, or they owe you money, or 70% of counseling sessions and therapy sessions are not officially terminated. Now, if you work in an agency and people have several sessions that they're mandated to, or if it's more regulated, that's different than if you're in private practice where you have control over that. But in private practice settings, or when you have control over your settings, 70% of people just leave or blow you off or cancel, or they don't necessarily go through a stage of termination. There used to be a sort of a rule where you should have at least 3 sessions to discuss termination and conclusion of the therapy. What was it like? What did you get out of it? How are you going to integrate this into your life? Particularly in sexuality counseling, where you're talking about integrating things you learn about sex into your relationship. So we'll talk about how to do that in a way that works for you. We're going to talk more about this phase of assessment and what actually happens in counseling when we go through the different types of counseling. So especially during this time in our history, in our culture, when a lot of the struggles that people have around sexuality are complicated, God bless you, are complicated by technology. So that it's not just an individual, it's an individual and their sexuality and technology. Porn, dating online, swiping, commitment issues. A lot of sexuality is not just internalized or somatic in their body. It's also got another piece, which is technology. And so it's the first time really that we've had these dilemmas. And so you as the counselor have to be conscious of how to integrate that into the counseling. You can't just say, well, turn off your phone. It's not an answer. And it's not a goal, because it's never going to happen. Everybody has a phone. Everybody has a laptop. Even young kids who can't afford to rub 2 ears of corn together have phones. And so they're looking at porn at 8 years old. And so that's influencing their sexuality. And so that's what's coming into your office. And so for you to think that kids are naive sexually means that you're sort of behind the 8 ball already. And for couples counseling, they're cheating on each other, lying in bed next to each other. And so we have a whole dilemma around monogamy issues and monogamy agreement violations. And so if you don't address the third leg of the triangle here, which is technology, then you're not addressing what's actually happening for people. So we have to talk about it. It has to be a talk aboutable thing. And meanwhile, you're in the session with your phone on your lap, getting texts. Don't tell me you're not. Because you're looking at your phone, or you hear your phone across the room, or you're taking notes on your computer, or your computer's on your desk. It's in the office with you. It's in the room. Now, maybe you're better than most people and you turn off your phone during your session, but I guarantee that on some level, there's some technology in the room with you. And so we have to acknowledge that that's happening. How many of you have been to a general practitioner lately and they sit on their computer with the screen in between you, asking about your symptoms and just clicking on the screen instead of looking at you and touching your body, instead of palpating, thank you. Palpating. Is that the word? Palpating?
Yeah.
You know what I'm thinking.
Palpitate, but we palpate.
Yes, that. Instead of palpating your glands or, touching your actual body. Do your glands hurt? Are your glands swollen? Looking over the screen, like that has infiltrated our whole mental health system as well. So we have to be conscious of that. So let's talk first about individual counseling. So in individual counseling, for sexuality issues, it's not just about sex, right? It's connecting, remembering, mindfulness, focusing, questions, paraphrasing, summarizing, reflecting, paying attention, safety, and silence. Which do you think is the hardest part for therapists or counselors? Silence. It's the most difficult thing for people to sit in a session and let there be space, let there be quiet. We will naturally fill up the silence. It's very hard for us to let there be a gap. And the more silence there is and the more you can fill that space up, the better. The number one reason that people come in for sexuality counseling is what I call attraction dysfunction. They are afraid that they have low desire or a desire discrepancy. I want more sex than my partner, or there's something wrong with me. I don't have desire. I have hypoactive desire disorder. I'm not into my partner anymore. There's something wrong with me. There's something wrong with them. How do I get out? How do I improve? It's not necessarily an arousal issue. It's a desire issue. Desire and arousal, remember, are two different things. And so individual sexuality counseling is sometimes underneath the desire issue a performance issue, like a sexual dysfunction, erectile dysfunction, orgasmic dysfunction, ejaculatory dysfunction. Sometimes there is an actual sexual dysfunction underneath, but it will show up as a desire issue. And that's part of the counseling too. What is showing up and how is it showing up and what's the real issue? Because what's going to show up in a sexuality counseling session is not necessarily the reason that people are there. What's going to show up in a counseling session many times is a sexuality issue. What identifies as a sexuality issue is many times something else, something more specific. So, for example, people are waiting longer and longer to have kids, okay? Like there is I think it's like a 40% increase in people freezing their eggs. I don't mean 40% across all women. I mean in the egg freezing business. And so people are waiting longer to have children. They're putting off child rearing to stay in their careers and putting off having families. And then, so they're freezing their eggs and then they have to go through fertility treatment to have kids when they're ready. Has anybody here been through fertility treatment? It's a really dramatic hormonal experience, and it wreaks havoc on a couple. So that fertility treatments in and of itself become a form of dysfunction in the couple. If you go through IVF, which is in vitro fertilization, you have to go through a series of hormonal treatments and harvesting and insertion, and it's pretty specific protocol, and it's incredibly stressful in the couple. And one of the things that people minimize is the stress on the father. So it's usually focused in couples counseling on the stress on the mother, but the stress on the father is pretty intense, particularly when the mother is stressed and then the father is stressed. And then if the in vitro works and they get pregnant and then they have a baby, and it's not like the stress goes away. So marital satisfaction decreases by 70% after you have a child. And then they're not sleeping, so they're still stressed. And then they're not having sex, so now they're doubly stressed. And then the expectation that the relationship was supposed to go back to what it was doesn't happen. And then it's still not healing, even though the kid is a little bit older. Yeah.
Do you know if there's any data on like subsequent children causing more stress in the relationship? Like, is there, or is it just one child and on, like any, or is it like each child you add causes more dissatisfaction?
Well, and actually, as the kids get older, it gets better. And sometimes when you add a second kid, they can play with the first kid. So they say that it takes stress off the mother, but the kid has to get older than 7 for it to make a difference. Me too. But most divorces happen when the kids are around 7. Because I think, this is what I make up, I think because by the time the kids are old enough to tie their shoes and put themselves on the bus, the parents have made it through that first, chunk of their lives, and they're so separated and disillusioned that they're like, okay, I'm out of here, I'm done. But if they can make it past that period of time, sometimes they come back together. But no one tells them how bad it's going to be. Because everyone's like, oh, it's a baby, it's so wonderful, and you're going to love it so much. Well, it's also going to suck. And and you have to be sort of realistic about that. Because you go home and you're like, oh my God, what do I do with this thing? And no one tells you how difficult it's going to be on your relationship.
Social media exacerbates it.
Social media
All these
exacerbates it.
social media stars or influencers who are like, oh, look at my perfect family and having a baby is so great. And it really, I think, does a disservice too.
Yeah, it's great when you have a nanny and a housekeeper and
Yeah.
a lot of help and you don't have to go to work.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I just did a podcast interview on my podcast, The Trouble with Sex, with Stephanie Bueller, who wrote a book before, during, and after pregnancy. And it's a good episode because she talks about the stress of around sex before, during, and after. And that a lot of couples come to her after they have a baby complaining about their sex life. And what she asks them is, well, what was it like before you got pregnant? And a lot of times they'll talk about in vitro or infertility issues, or even not feeling connected before they got pregnant. And she's like, well, what made you think that it was going to get better? Because you're bringing in stressful sex all the way through a young child and into your family life. And so now it's just compounded and getting worse. So it's a good episode, and she's right. So, and you're also looking at the roles that you play in a family. This guy started a social media program to try to get changing tables in men's bathrooms, because he was like, look, I'm responsible for my kid and I can't change his diaper because men's bathrooms are disgusting. And in public restrooms everywhere, there's never any changing tables. And so he took pictures of himself changing his baby everywhere, like in all these public restrooms, and posted them all over social media. And he got a lot of places to put in changing tables in restaurants and rest stops and stuff, truck stops. But it talks about, the idea that we project all this toxicity on men, and particularly now in the Me Too movement, and that there's a lot of men who are good dads and really nurturing and want to be good fathers. And we don't see that too much. We project a lot of negativity in social media around men right now. And that the role of men in families, and particularly, across cultures, is important to portray and to also talk about in the office and in the family. So when we talk about the roles that people play, let's also talk about identity in sexual identity. We know that at least half of all non-heterosexual people today are bisexual, pansexual, sexually fluid, which means that people don't identify as gay or straight or bi, that they identify somewhere on a fluid continuum. We know that 4.5% of people identify as gay, lesbian, or bisexual, which doesn't seem like a lot, but actually when you think about the population of people, that is pretty high, although that's only people who identify. Can you please keep the door open? It's really too hot to close it. Thank you. 0.7% identify as trans, 4% as just non-binary, 1% asexual, which means they don't identify as anything, but they do identify as not being sexual. 20% of women say that they're mostly heterosexual. And 9% of men say they're mostly heterosexual. So they don't say they're bisexual, they don't say that they're sexually fluid, they're just mostly hetero. And so there's a difference between identity versus expression versus orientation. So our sex is whether we are male or female or intersex. That's the body that we're born into. Our identity, our sexual identity, is who we feel like we are. So regardless of the body that we're in, it's who we feel that we are. Our gender expression is how we present ourselves in the world. Interestingly, if you're over 40, you might identify yourself as a cross-dresser. People under 40 don't call themselves cross-dressers, they call themselves non-binary. But people over 40 don't use that term. That's based on Margie Nichols' research. Sexual orientation is who you're attracted to. So in this gender spectrum, it means that gender is not just binary. It's not just male, female. There's a whole spectrum in the middle. Hi. Are you here to look at the heat?
Yes.
Because it's hot in here.
Yeah.
I'm very happy that you're here to look at the heat.
What's that?
I'm very happy that you're here to look at the heat.
I'll see what I can do, but this is actually a unit in Chicago school.
Yeah.
So
So what does that mean?
not one of my units that supplies here.
Okay, so what does that mean? It's not going to get fixed?
Talk to, I don't know what it means.
Okay.
I'm not going to be able to do anything right this minute.
Okay.
It's going to take a while.
Okay. All right. Thank you for looking into it. Thank you. So gender being on a spectrum means that we have a lot of sort of non-binary identities. And so people are calling themselves different things. Some people say they're gender queer. Some people just say they're queer. Some people say they're gender neutral. Some people identify as gender fluid, which is on that spectrum. I have had people say that they're of two spirits or bigender. Part of it has to do with their age. Part of it has to do with where in the country they are. Part of it has to do with how they were raised in a culture and the gender roles that they've taken on, that they've learned in their families. And frankly, it really has to do with what their friends are calling themselves too. And some people are really connected to their identity. And some people, a lot of young people are like, I don't want to be called anything. Just don't try to box me in with a name. I'm not anything. All right? So even more than fluid, they're just open to whatever. I love who I love. I am what I am. And, I won't be labeled. So this is from Margie Nichols, the new sexual orientation identities that we can identify right now that people who are coming into your office, you might hear or see. Asexual means without sexual feelings, and that's okay for them. It just means that it's perfectly fine to identify as someone who's just not sexual, and that might be their identity, not just a flicker of time or a moment in their relationship, but that they're not sexual people. Demisexual is someone who only has sex with people that they feel emotionally connected to. That's how they identify. You don't have to agree or disagree or argue about the term. It's just how they identify themselves. Bisexual are sexually oriented to both men and women. Bi-curious means you're curious about the same sex, but you don't necessarily identify as someone who's bisexual. Heteroflexible, mostly straight, pansexual, aromantic, or scoliosexual is someone who's attracted to transsexuals. Non-binary is being on the gender spectrum, again, not entirely male or female, non-binary, fluid, queer, and then I told you the cross-dressing thing. So out of all of that, what we do know and what you should be aware of is that this also applies to what we call the minority stress model. So this applies cross-culturally, intergenerationally, and also to sexual orientation, that sex and gender diverse minorities face unique and hostile stressors. And comorbidity and psychological issues can disappear with affirmative care. So may disappear with affirmative care. May disappear. And affirmative care means that you recognize it, that you talk about it, that you place yourself in the session as someone who might be privileged and not of the same gender or of the same culture, or maybe not of the same gender role, that we talk about intersectionality and cross-culturalism in the sessions so that everything's a talk-aboutable thing, and recognizing that there is stress in being a minority, whether it's about your sex or gender role, and that we may be in a position of privilege just by being someone's counselor. Just by being someone's counselor, that we are in that privileged place, we hold that space for someone else, and that there might be stress in that. Sometimes people feel like they don't want to talk about sex, but they feel like they have to just because we ask them. And that creates a stress too. And so there may be a disclaimer that you use in the beginning, like, this is sexuality counseling. I'm going to ask you about your sex life. You are entitled to tell me as much or as little as you feel comfortable. So that it's not a power position. And because I'm asking you and I'm in a place of power, you are now in a position where you have to disclose something that perhaps you wouldn't if you didn't feel like I was pressuring you somehow because I'm in the position of power. And this is a new discussion that we're having. How is the counselor and the therapist in a position of power in sex therapy or sexuality counseling in a manipulative role? And it's up for more discussion. So we'll talk about it. These are the basic steps of an individual counseling session. Whether you're talking about sex, whether you're talking about depression, whether you're talking about your family issues. Basically, why did you seek therapy? What is the current symptom? What brought you into the session? All right? What are you feeling? What are the behaviors? What are you feeling in your body? Sometimes if people don't talk, it's great to say, well, what are you feeling in your body right now? All right? And how is this affecting your life or your relationships or your work? What do you imagine is the solution? Because a lot of times counseling is about the problem, particularly when we talk about sex. And when we talk about couples counseling, the idea that you're not giving me enough, it's not going right, it's not the right kind, you're not doing it well enough, I don't like the way you're doing it, it's all focused on dysfunction. And it's our job to change the conversation from, I hate it when you go to the left, to I love it when you go to the right. Because sex counseling is about changing the conversation from sexual pathology to sexual pleasure. If you keep focusing on the dysfunction and the pathology, the counseling will not work. It won't work, and in fact, it becomes more entrenched. It becomes more systemic, and it becomes more part of the languaging in the system. Because people just get better about talking about it. They just get better at understanding what the problem is, but they don't get better at the solution. So in a way, it's solution-focused therapy without having to be brief. Solution-focused therapy is a form of brief therapy. It doesn't have to be brief, but it does have to shift from dysfunction and pathology to a pleasure model. How can we go from what's not working, what you're not doing well, how you're sabotaging your life, to what your skills are that could actually improve it? Because most people have a vision of what they want and what could go well, and that vision might not be our vision. Right? So I'll give you an example. I have a young guy who he has Peyronie's disease. Peyronie's is a bent penis. It's usually an injury with scar tissue built up. And it's really painful because every time you get an erection, it tears the scar tissue. And so the scar tissue reforms and gets thicker. And so the older he gets, the longer he has it, the more the penis is bent around the scar tissue. So it's most likely that it was from an earlier injury, probably in his late adolescence, because you can break your penis. It is something that when erect you can injure. And he was someone who in college, they used to take Viagra. We talked about this yesterday. And they took Viagra in addition to ADHD medication, in addition to snorting coke, because they thought it would make them last longer, have better sex, be better lovers. And if you combine a PDE5 inhibitor, it drives the blood flow to your extremities. But while you're taking that with a stimulant, it increases your heart rate and your blood pressure. And that's not a good combo with Viagra. And when you're 20 years old, you don't really need Viagra. Most men don't. And so what would happen is many times the erections would last longer than 4 or 5 hours. Sometimes the guys would have to go to the emergency room and get the blood drained out of their penis with a needle. And he had to have that several times. And my guess is that needle probably created an injury. Either that or he was so erect and had sex in ways that might have broken it at some point. And so now when he has sex, he has an erection and he has an ejaculation, it's really super painful. So why he sought therapy is because he has been avoiding all relationships. He had a bad breakup. He's now realizing that he's probably gay. He's probably been gay all his life, but he's only been with women. And now he's at this fulcrum in his life where he's got to make a decision. But he's afraid to come all the way out because he's afraid that no one will want to be with him because of his penis, and he feels broken. So the current symptom is his Peyronie's, which is painful and has to be taken care of. You can go to a urologist, and sometimes you can get a stim machine where gives you sort of stimulation to that area to break up the scar tissue. Sometimes you need surgery. Massage, creams won't fix it. Depends on the problem. But really why he sought therapy was for his sexual identity issues he's been struggling with his whole life. He had a really rigid family life, and his coming out process has been fraught with conflict, internal conflict and conflict with his family, who was quite religious. So the feelings and behaviors and body sensations, he's got shame, he's got guilt, he's got embarrassment, he's got anger because he feels like he did this to himself. He's also perhaps got a substance abuse problem. So we have to explore that. In the body sensations, when I ask him, what are you feeling right now in your body? It's not centered around his genitals. It's actually centered around his chest. He's got a lot of pressure in his chest. So we start to talk about not just the emotional pain that might indicate, but anxiety. He's got a ton of anxiety. And the anxiety has just ratcheted it up so much. He's like a mechanical engineer, and his job is super stressful, and it's just ratcheted it up to the point where he can barely function. And so we're talking about how that affects his work and his relationships. He doesn't want to go out. He doesn't want to date. He goes on Grindr and swipes a lot, but he doesn't contact anybody. He sometimes has mutual masturbation on the internet, but it's painful. And he doesn't want to be around someone who may not understand that. But what I imagine is the solution in my mind, what I make up, is that he should go to a urologist, he should take care of the Peyronie's disease, and that will clear up a lot of his issues. But that's not his vision. So when I ask him what his vision is to meet a woman who he thinks will nurture him through this experience. And so we're exploring that, like, what is that, like a parentified relationship? Is he projecting like he wants a good mom that's going to help him? And now we're talking about, like, does he think I'm the good mom? And so it's an object relations counseling. So we're talking about what happened with his mom, because his mom was not a good mom. She was very shaming, and she walked in on him a couple times masturbating and tied his hands to the bed. I know, very sad. So we're talking about what the vision would be of his healing. And then, so I review at the beginning of every session what we talked about the last time. I take notes during the session. I have a notebook on my lap because I can't remember from the last time. Sometimes I don't even remember when I look at my calendar and it says Bill S. is coming into the session. I'm like, who's Bill? Even though I see Bill every week on my calendar, I'm like, wait, which one's Bill? And that's just age. And maybe early onset dementia, I'm not sure. But you're welcome. I'm glad we share that. But once I see them, I'm like, oh yeah, that's Bill. But I have to keep notes on what happened. So then I look at my notes from last week and I'm like, so this is what happened, and I'm wondering how you did during the week. Sometimes I give assignments. For this guy, I give him some assignments around masturbation, different ways to figure out what works for him that could be less painful. And then I mirror what he says. So when he says, well, I did it, but I can only masturbate in a prone position, which is face down. So I'll say, well, that's interesting. So you can only masturbate in the prone position. So it seems like, you're hiding. I wonder if that rings true for you, or if that's just something I'm making up. And he says, no, that might be true. And I said, oh, so that might be true. Do you want to talk more about that? So I try to validate and mirror what he says. And then at the end of the session, I will give more interventions or suggestions or something to be a transitional object from one session to the next. It's not just homework and suggestions. If you just give cognitive behavioral suggestions, then he could get that on the internet. The suggestions in the homework are to be a transitional object. It's like you give a teddy bear to a kid when you're not there, and they transfer your connection to the teddy bear so that they can get through the week till they see you. It's like a blankie. It's like hanging their artwork on the refrigerator. Like, it's a transitional object until the next time you see them. for people who are super, super distraught, I give them something from my office. I have like rocks, different things, and I'll give them something, and I'll say it's a homework assignment. Like, take this home and hold this rock when you're feeling anxious, because it's a transitional object from my office. And people, come back years later with the same rock. And what I've noticed is sometimes clients will give me a gift, like a candle or something, and I don't really know if that's good or bad, but I find it interesting, and we'll talk about it, what that's about. And then you can, close the session. Remember, even the terminating of a session is important, not just terminating of the therapy. So what I'd like you to do is do a therapy session with someone in the room. So you're going to pick someone that you didn't work with before, someone that you don't know, and you're going to pick a topic. Could be a sexual issue. And one of you is going to be the therapist, and you're going to go through these steps, and you can have fun with it, but don't be a mean patient. Be nice to your therapist. It's so fun to be really mean and act out, and because you finally get your acting on, and you're like, oh, I feel like Brad Pitt now. I'm going to really act out. But don't. And just be relatively nice, and see if you can go through these stages, and then switch. Okay? So we're going to talk more now about mastering basic sexuality counseling skills. So you are all good therapists. You are all excellent at the things that you're excellent at. And you don't know what you don't know. And you can get better at the things that you need to improve on. So in sexuality counseling, it's just similar to individual counseling, but we are really focused on the integration of the body, the mind, and the relationship. Okay, so if there's a relational component, we use and integrate the body. So the body is not something separate that people go home to. The body is in the session. Sexuality counseling is not surrogate therapy counseling. People keep their clothes on. It's one of the most difficult things for people to wrap their minds around, and one of the scariest things for sex therapists and counselors and educators, because people are confused about what it means. So a lot of people have seen the movie with Helen Hunt, where she's a sex surrogate, and she goes to someone's house, and they're naked in bed together. And so sometimes people think that's what sexuality counseling or sex therapy is. I'll tell you a story. I have an office in New Haven, Connecticut, in Fairfield, Connecticut, and in Santa Monica, California. In my Fairfield, Connecticut office, it's like a satellite office, and I share it with a massage therapist. So when people walk in, there's a massage table in my office, and it never fails that they stop for a minute, and they're like, wait, what? Or they stop and go, oh. With a big smile on their face, and I'm like, yeah, no. And so I have to, particularly with new people, be very clear that this is my roommate's, my office mate's massage table. She's a great massage therapist, but that's not what sex counseling or sex therapy is. You'll keep all your clothes on, and it's a talking type of counseling that integrates conversation. So we're going to talk about psychological things using your mind, and we're going to integrate areas around your relationship, whether it's the relationship to your current partner, your future partner, or your past relationships in your family. And we're also going to integrate what's going on in your body, whether it's dysfunction, whether it's performance issues, or how you experience or avoid pleasure. So sexuality counseling is very unique in that it's not just counseling where you talk a little bit about sex. It is the primary focus. And the power of sexuality counseling is such that it is the one thing that you can do with people that will heal them from their trauma. Sexuality counseling can heal people from their trauma because we're focusing on how people experience pleasure. Pleasure in your body is loose and receptive. When you think about something that's pleasurable, think about, like for me, taking a bath or sitting in a hot tub is very pleasurable. It's relaxing. Trauma is rigid. Trauma is protective. When you feel traumatized or something traumatic happens, your body reacts with rigidity to protect itself. It gets ready to fight or to flee. It's in a protective rigidity mode. It's the opposite of pleasure. So it's hard to feel pleasure if you're in that rigid mode. If you're in a female body, you can't even orgasm if you're in that mode. Although it can appear that you go rigid prior to orgasm because the buildup of arousal can look similar to someone who's feeling pain. Right? If you've ever seen pictures of people who are about to orgasm, it looks exactly like they're in pain. And sometimes pain and pleasure are in the same pathway. But pain and trauma can be interwoven so that the pleasure can heal people from a traumatic neurological pathway. So orgasm is the greatest behavioral reinforcer that your body can experience. There's nothing more pleasurable. That flood of hormones and brain chemicals can actually override a traumatic experience. That doesn't mean that you can tell your client, go home and masturbate, and then you'll forget your trauma. That's not quite how it works. But we do work in several different ways in sexuality counseling and sex therapy. Originally, sex counseling, sexuality counseling, counseling around sexual issues was based on cognitive behavioral therapy. So cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is based on the idea that you have a thought or a feeling, and that leads to a behavior. And then you have another thought or an attitude about that. It creates a feeling, another behavior, and that we can interrupt that pattern. And you can change that cycle anywhere you want to. So if you have a feeling and it leads to a behavior, you can stop in that cycle and stop yourself from doing that behavior. It doesn't feel necessarily like you can all the time. It feels like a natural response. So in other words, your partner does something that annoys you and you automatically respond in a certain way. You get up and leave the room. And that behavior feels unconscious, and it feels like that reaction is something you've been doing your whole life. You can create a conscious awareness in that cycle in therapy by talking about it, by being aware, by functioning in the cognitive realm, by revisiting those thoughts, by changing that behavior, and then as a result of that behavior change, creating a new cycle. And that's probably what you learned in school is CBT. How many of you have learned cognitive behavioral therapy? How many of you have practiced cognitive behavioral therapy on some level in your life? You're probably doing it right now because you probably want to get up and leave the room because it's really hot in here. And that behavior normally would be, I'm uncomfortable, I want to get up and do something different. But you're telling yourself something that is trained in your mind to pay attention regardless of discomfort. So you've broken that pattern that perhaps you had as a younger person where you learn to override discomfort. So you're sitting here, You're telling yourself, I can do this. It'll be okay. I'll ignore my bodily functions. I'll try to go into my head and be in my cognition. Some of you have a stronger somatic reaction than others, and it's hard to ignore the function of your body. But your experience doesn't necessarily determine your behavior, nor does it determine your outcome. So it's like someone's sexual experience not determining their orientation. So like I have men that are identified as heterosexual that come into my office and say they've had sex with other men, and their wives are accusing them of being gay, and they wonder if they're gay, but sexual experience doesn't necessarily determine orientation. So what determines orientation is more about who you want to be snuggling up on the couch with every night, not necessarily what makes your penis hard in the moment. Sexual experience doesn't determine orientation, doesn't determine who you want to marry, or even who might turn you on when you're walking on the beach. Experience doesn't determine future experience either. So cognitive behavioral therapy can help in sex counseling by helping people break that connection that they have with their experience, that they would automatically connect with outcome. I did this, therefore. So how many of you have had couples where a heterosexual couple where the man is masturbating to porn and the woman walks in and she says, "Oh my God, you're cheating on me." And he says, "I don't know what you're talking about. I've been doing this my whole life." Right? And she says, "No, I think you're a sex addict and we have to go to therapy and get help." And he says, "Well, maybe I do have a problem. Maybe I am addicted to porn. Maybe there is a problem. Maybe I've been an addict my whole life. Maybe because I'm masturbating to porn and I'm looking at people who are in male bodies, maybe that means I'm gay." But experience, even when it's connected to something that is sexually arousing, doesn't determine orientation, nor does it determine outcome. So it doesn't mean that he's going to continue to pursue outside relationships with the men, nor does it mean he's going to continue to have that fantasy. It could mean that. It absolutely could. And it could mean that that's what turns him on and that's what he's going to need. But it depends on the meaning of sex. So the meaning is different than the outcome. The meaning is different than the outcome, and actually the meaning is different than the experience. So we have an experience and we attach a narrative to it. We attach a meaning. So you might have sex with a man and it's going to be different than you having sex with a man, than you having sex with a man, than you having sex with a man. That meaning, that outcome, that narrative in your head is totally dependent on your early relationships, your current relationships, and what you make up about your future relationships. So I want you to think about these three questions. What does sex mean to me? How has sex made me who I am? And what does sex mean in my relationship? These are questions you can ask your client, but first I want you to ask them to yourself. And just take a few minutes to write down some answers. First things that come to your mind. There's no wrong answers here. So what did you discover about yourself? Anything that you want to share? What's one thing that came up for you? Some giggling back there in the corner. Yes.
These were more difficult than I expected. So I imagine they will be difficult for clients to answer, and they're not going to exactly roll off the tongue. And the second one in particular, I struggled with and kind of had to look at it as a continuum or kind of a lifelong process. That was helpful.
Yeah, so when we think about how has sex made you who you are, it's a lifelong process. It's a continuum, right? Exactly.
That particular question kind of brings up your vulnerable spot.
Brings up a vulnerable spot.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so to just dump that in a session on someone is like,
Somebody you don't know whatsoever.
right, it's vulnerable. Yeah, it's a good point.
I don't think that'd be just saying, here, hand out these questionnaires. Here you go. They'll be there. But you put it in an interesting way. You didn't say, do you feel like sex has anything to do with, or, making you who you are? You just assumed it, and you said, how has sex made you who you are? Which I love, because it's integral, right?
Right, and it's assumed.
It's assumed. I love that.
It's not a yes or no question.
No.
So you're looking for the conversation. You're looking to get people to talk about it. It's like saying, how much do you drink instead of do you drink? How often do you masturbate every day instead of do you masturbate and how often? Like, it's just an assumption so that people feel like the field is open for response. And it's not judgy. You want to say something?
I think I was having difficulty answering really all three of them, and my head kept thinking about the different relationships I've had with sex. So which one am I in now? Like, how has each of them had an impact? So it was a very difficult set of questions to answer.
Yeah. And when you think of yourself as a therapist today and think of yourself as a sexual person, both of them are context dependent. So it depends on the context, right? When you're thinking of yourself as a therapist, you're thinking of yourself as a partner, you're thinking of yourself as an individual, as a woman, as a man, as someone in a male body, a female body, as someone in the end of a relationship, in the beginning of a relationship, in a polyamorous relationship, just opening, just closing, just being broken up with, like it's all context dependent. So I get women sometimes who come in and say they have no desire for their husband, like there's something wrong with them. They are suffering from low desire, and then they get divorced and they want to sleep with everyone. So that tells me very clearly, as an example, that desire is context dependent. Right? Or when you have a fight with someone and you don't want to have sex, or you are in the crisis phase after an affair and you want to have a lot of sex with your partner. Even though you're mad at them and you can't stand them and you don't want to forgive them, you still feel this crazy erotic charge with them. So it's really context dependent. And you'll notice in your own work, sitting with a client, you will get triggered, activated. You might feel some desire in the session. This was, years ago when we used to talk about countertransference, this was like the boogeyman question, they used to call it. What happens when you feel sexual desire in a session? Yeah. It was like, oh my God, run to therapy, go get supervision immediately, shut it down, push it away. It was a really threatening moment in psychotherapy. As a sex therapist, you're talking about sex all day. If you're going to do sexuality counseling, if you work for a clinic like Planned Parenthood, or if you work in a church, or if you work in like an STD clinic, or if you work in a doctor's office, or sometimes the counseling is very context dependent. If you're working as a sexuality counselor and the context is we're going to talk about your sex life, like around desire or around fantasy, or if you're working in an agency where it's focused on kink and BDSM or open marriage, or whatever the context is, if it has a crossover to your own personal life, you're bound to have feelings. Feelings are natural and preferred. And actually, the more you feel, the more information it gives you around countertransference. So countertransference is really super important because it means the feelings you feel when the client is sitting with you in your office. That information helps you to determine how to work with someone. So what it is that you feel in your body. Earlier, we talked about what the client feels in their body, asking them what are they feeling. But as you sit with your client, what do you feel in your body? What do you feel emotionally? What do you feel spiritually? That means like the energy in the space in between you. What do you feel psychologically? And what do you feel in your actual skin? So those areas are information that are primarily like radar for you to give you information about the client. Yes, it might be your stuff. Yes, you might be getting activated. Yes, you might be having memories. Yes, you might be having sexual desire. All kinds of things and fantasies can come up. That is information about the client. That is coming through those 4 areas to give you information that you need to help them. And that's brilliant that that's happening. That's fantastic. If you know how to use it, if you know how to translate it, if you know that, wow, isn't it interesting? I'm having this memory of my old boyfriend from high school and when we used to make out at the lake. I'm really like, this person really reminds me of that person. And going down that path of remembering and fantasizing and having that fantasy of how great it was to make out when I was 17 and knowing that, recognizing that, being in that moment and feeling that feeling is super important because that's giving me information about the client. And that's telling me something about that client. Why is that client reminding me of Todd Smith? Because if I really sit back and think about it and examine my own countertransference, Todd Smith was an alcoholic. And Todd Smith was sexy and handsome, but he was really not able to be present in a relationship because he had his own alcoholism problems. And when I think about that and I'm aware of my countertransference, it suddenly dawns on me, oh my God, this person is an alcoholic. He's talking about his inability to be in a relationship, and he's talking about his girlfriend problems, and he's talking about his sexual dysfunction. How many drinks do you drink a day, George? Oh, 7 or 8, no big deal. Perhaps that's connected to your sexual dysfunction. That information is the information that's coming to you out of all these senses that you don't even maybe realize that you're having. It's like the juice of the session. And so the noticing for you, the being present, not just for the other person or the couple, but for yourself, is the key to your success, really, with a couple or a patient. And how to interpret that is the difference between a beginning counselor and an experienced therapist. So one example I use a lot is I had a couple who used to come in every week, and they were very good couple, and they were wonderful, and they were coming in for their desire issues, and they were very compliant, and they paid me every week, and they were lovely, and I was really not wanting to see them. And every week I was like really anxious, and I was like, oh God, it's Thursday, I should cancel. I just don't want to be here. And they were in the office, waiting for me when I got there, and I was just dreading seeing them. And finally I realized as I was sitting in the office with them that my anxiety was probably not about me. And I said, God, I'm wondering if you guys are feeling anxious. I just feel anxious. And she was like, oh, thank God. I'm so happy you said that because I hate coming here. And so we began this whole conversation about their anxiety around couples therapy, around sex, around her people pleasing, them trying to be good. He was not happy about coming either. Like, it brought out finally the real truth underneath. And it really wasn't my anxiety. It was theirs. And that's what happens is that you are like a magnet for their stuff in that room. You're holding the space for their emotion. So if you think about a client, think about, do you like them? Sometimes liking them isn't really about them. You probably don't even really know them. It's reminding you of someone or something. And maybe they are manipulating you so that you will like them, because liking them is really important to them. And why? Why is it important for them to be liked? What is it about their childhood or their past or their issues that they have an authority figure or a parent figure or someone in their life that likes them? What would happen if they weren't liked? What's underneath that? I have a client who, she just works so hard to tell me how wonderful I am. Oh, you're just amazing. You've just saved my relationship. You've saved my marriage. You just saved my life. And she brings me coffee. And I'm like, I don't want your coffee. And, it's like 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm not going to drink it. This giant gallon of Dunkin' Donuts coffee. She just works so hard to be liked. So it's not so much that she likes me. She wants me to like her. And when we talked about it further, she had a father who was super abusive. He used to make her kneel on rice. He's from the military. And her mother never rescued her from the father. And so one of her survival skills is fawning. So you have fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And she fawns over me to try to get the attention that she didn't get from her mother who didn't rescue her. And so I asked her, what do you want me to rescue you from? Like, what are you looking for? What are you trying to get me to pay attention to? What's happening? And so we were talking about that now. And even though she seems like she's so successful because she likes me so much and I'm so wonderful, she's probably one of my hardest cases. Because there's something underneath, something big under there. Underneath all that bravado and love and, adoration, which, don't get me wrong, feels great, especially at the end of the day. But there's something that means something. Because in my countertransference, it feels sickly sweet, like the coffee that she brings. Right? But she also dumps like 8 sugars in there. Exactly. Exactly. Their life is. Yeah, so that's exactly right. It takes 2 or 3 sessions, usually before they show you exactly what it feels like to be in their life. And usually it's hard, or else they wouldn't be there.
Yeah.
They wouldn't come in if it wasn't hard. It's a self-selected population, so they only come in because it's hard. The ones that it's working for don't come to therapy, so you don't see them. But you're absolutely right. It takes 2 or 3 sessions, and then you start to feel what's really happening in the room with them, and that's what it feels like to be with them. You might feel argumentative with them. You might get angry. They might blow you off. They may not pay. Whatever the conflict and the dilemma is, you'll start to feel. But yes, you're absolutely right. And most of the dilemma has to do with the needs in the relationship. So all relationships need time, attention, affection, and sex. But each partner is going to need that in different amounts. So it's like a pie that is divided into 4 slices. And each partner will need a different slice. So you might need more time and your partner needs more sex. You might need more affection. They might need more attention. And this is a good model because it works with open relationships as well and polyamorous relationships. Each partner in a multi-partnered system needs different things, and sometimes the misunderstandings are really not about the pie slice that you think it's about. So sometimes people come in because they are upset that their partner's spending too much time with an outside partner, when really it's not about the time, it's about the attention. You're giving her so much attention, you're on your phone all the time, you're texting all the time, you're sending love letters, and I get nothing. So if you would just spend a little bit more attention on me, I'd be fine. Because you spend all your time with me, but your time is divided by your attention to the other person. Or I don't care if you have sex with them, but when you're home with me, cuddle up with me on the couch or spoon me in bed or be more affectionate. And then, everyone has a different language around how they model this and how they discuss it and communicate about it. But in your office, it's a great way to ask, what do you need and what bothers you about what you're getting or not getting? What do you long for? It's a language of love. People also have different erotic needs. So this might be hard to see because it got smushed, but people have need for safety, trust, and connection, which is usually around attachment needs, or intensity and challenge, which is a little bit more differentiated, or fantasy and adventure, which is usually a call for antidote to boredom, to shake things up. Now, you might have even more needs than that. So if you can think about something that you need in your erotic life that's not on here, what else would you add? Just make a note. Like, would it be romance? Would it be kink? Would it be... I'm sure you could think of other things that you could add to your list. I don't want to give you ideas. I want you to think of it yourself. So just see if you can add 1 or 2 on a piece of paper. You don't have to tell anyone. This is just for you. And take a minute to think about what is it that you want to add to your list. What else do you need? I asked this of a class the other day, and somebody said, sex toys. All right, good. Fine. Does anyone not have one? So this is a good way to language erotic needs with a couple or an individual. What do they need and how are they getting it or how are they not getting it? And the other part of sex counseling is fantasy. In object relations, the transference from an object or an adult who raises you as a child. It's different than attachment in that attachment implies you attach to one adult, and that is either a secure attachment, an anxious attachment, or avoidant attachment. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. But in object relations theory, you grow up and it's the fantasy of that object that it's a sort of a psychoanalytic theory that you then integrate into you and project onto your partners. So we will marry someone who's got the positive, or commit to someone who's got the positive and negative traits of our parent figure or object. And truly, it's a projection. It's like a fantasy. It's like we project a mask onto that person. We don't really see that person for the first few years until that mask comes off, and then we say, well, wait a minute, who are you? And then you have to decide if you really want to be with that person, if you're really in love with that person, and not the projection. So fantasy is many times a projection. And it's also a way of dealing with the anxiety of separation from your object. As a young child, we have the capacity to be separated from our parents and not freak out and not be psychotic psycho killers, except apparently a few people who end up that way. And some people are exploring that and writing books about it, which must happen in the early phases. I can't imagine how else that would happen, unless it's biochemical. But that's another. Yeah, I do want to hear more about that, though. So within the normal range of development with object relations, we create fantasy to help us survive feelings of discomfort, loneliness, detachment, and feelings of social isolation. And as adults, we translate that same skill set into our sex life in the same mechanism, as a way to use pleasure to deal with anxiety. So we translate that same mechanism as a way to use pleasure to handle our anxiety. It's actually quite brilliant as a survival skill, because we can manifest something pleasurable as a way to heal ourselves psychologically. Now, all mammals are sexual, but humans are erotic because we have the capacity to eroticize sex. We can fantasize. We can project and make sex something bigger than just put tab A into slot B. Now, except they think dolphins might be able to fantasize. They think dolphins might have sex that's expanded and more pleasurable than just reproduction. Saucy dolphins, she said. Well, Margie Nichols said that dolphins sometimes can swim around by just sticking their beak into, like two female dolphins can swim around. One can stick their beak into the female's vagina and they just swim around for fun like that. Who knew? They are quite saucy. And so, many animals in the animal kingdom are probably much more sexual than people realize. I mean, pigs have really big clitorises, actually. And why they would have a clitoris if they're not orgasming and feeling pleasure, there's no other purpose for a clitoris. So we're probably really underestimating the animal kingdom around pleasure.
If you look at male and female hyenas and how actually requires a sign of submission from the male before she will agree to mating, and if she submission signal usually doesn't go well. It's quite feisty, but it's very interesting to watch.
That's true with bonobos too. So if you listen to or read Wednesday Martin, she wrote Untrue, and actually I'll talk about her a little bit too. She did a lot of anthropological research about the mating habits of female bonobos and different types of chimps. And they do the same thing. They slam their, whatever the monkeys have, down. What are they? Paws. whatever, yeah. And they slam it down hard until the males do the same thing. They submit. But they're very demanding. And they will drag like a monkey into the jungle and have hot monkey sex for like 2 weeks, and they drag them back and pick someone else. And they're the closest to us, closest mammal to us. And the females are super sexual. So that may be one indicator. But there are other indicators too. We know that the praying mantis, the female bites the male's head off after she has sex with him. You've served your purpose. Yeah, we don't know if that's their fantasy, though. I don't know if she's doing it out of pleasure or if it's a biologically driven mating capacity. But in our human capacity for fantasy, I do know that under your sexual fantasies are desires, and there's a desire for something. So if your fantasies run along a submissive drive, it's a desire to not be in control, of somebody else be in control. A lot of women in our society today who are in charge of their homes, of their jobs, their kids, they just don't want to be in charge in bed. And so that's an anatomically sort of aligned parallel process because it goes along with the way that women orgasm. But also, if you have a fantasy of being more dominant, that also is aligned with anatomy as well for females and males, because it means you can be in charge of your orgasm and you can be in charge of your pleasure. And so the desire in both of those cases is either relaxation, release of stress, complete the orgasm, to find pleasure, but there's underlying psychological reasons for it as well. And the longing underneath it is usually actually from childhood. And it is a psychological need to heal from anxieties and unmet attachment wounds. And I don't mean attachment wounds like parentifying a partner during sex. I mean like an unmet need that only a partner during sex, and it doesn't have to be a love partner, it could just be a sexual partner, can fulfill. So I'll give you an example, and you heard this the other day, of the case of a woman who's in my book, and I use this example often, of the woman who had claustrophobia, and she came to me for panic attacks. She was trapped in an elevator, and she lived in Manhattan, and she would have panic attacks all the time. And she came to me because she was afraid of commitment as well. And she came for individual counseling to deal with her panic, but also to move along in her relationship. And eventually she came in with her partner to work on their relationship issues and to have counseling around their sex life. And when I did the fantasy exercise with them, which we're going to show you, it came out that her fantasy was actually to be trapped. So even though it was her biggest fear, her fantasy was to be tied down, to be trapped, to be held down. And when we processed that together in the sex counseling and the couples counseling, when they established some safety and some trust, they created a safe word, and she asked him if he would do it. He wanted to do it. They went home. They acted out the fantasy. He tied her up with silk scarves. She had a safe word in case it got too intense. And she had an orgasm. She came back and said it was amazing. And then 3 days later, she got stuck in the elevator. And she started to have the same symptoms of panic that she'd always have when she got stuck in that elevator, which always broke down. And she started to have increased heart rate, increased panic feeling, increased blood pressure. Her pulse was racing. But she didn't go into a full-blown panic attack because her body had a body memory of pleasure. Just like we have body memories from trauma, where we get activated or triggered, if you will, and we go back to those old feelings and back to those old body responses, Like if you've been a soldier in the war and you come back to home in your home experience and you hear a loud noise or a truck backfiring, you may have a trauma response and go into a rigid pose. You may go into a rigid survival skill pose. She went into a response that was connected to the pleasure alignment in her brain. So she's created a new neurological pathway that overrode that old survival skill panic response because pleasure overrides fear. And so her anxiety was to be trapped. And yet that pleasure response is a new neurological pathway, like a new deer path in the woods that overrode that. And she did not have an orgasm in the elevator. But there's no reason that you can't override things that are traumatic or painful or anxiety producing so that you can teach yourself how to reduce your fears. Underneath all sexual fantasy is at its root a desire to heal your psychology from anxiety or fear. So in this case, her desire was for someone to care enough to actually want her to be there. She grew up in a family where there was 6 or 7 kids, and they all sort of ran free in the streets in the city. No one ever called her home for dinner. No one noticed that she was gone. She would disappear for days at a time and sort of run free. And she ended up dropping out of school, leaving home when she was like in 10th grade. No one really noticed she was gone. So her longing is for someone to say, don't go anywhere. I want you here. Don't leave me. I care enough for you to be here now and to tie you up so you won't go anywhere. So her survival skill was to be able to leave, to always have an out, to never be tied down, so she always knew she could escape. And yet, what she really longed for was that unmet need that someone loved her enough to say, stay. And so underneath all fantasies are desires, longings, and unmet needs. If you think about your own sexual fantasies, you can go through that process and explore that. I'll give you one other one that's in the book. There's a guy who had a mother who was chronically depressed his whole life, and he couldn't please her no matter what he did. He never could make her happy, and she died a chronically unhappy, depressed woman. And his sexual fantasy is to please a woman, like to give her multiple orgasms through oral sex. And his desire is to make a woman happy. That longing is to have someone say, you made me happy. I see you. You're so good at this. Thank you. That unmet need was really to have his mother say, you made me not feel depressed. You saved my life. You were here for me. You're amazing. You made me so happy. And so in the sessions, the idea of fantasy, whether you're talking about someone's deep sexual fantasy or just the fantasy that you might have right now to not be in this room and maybe be at the beach with your feet in the sand, or maybe skiing someplace cool. Like that escape fantasy is a response to feeling like you don't have control over something. We will always fantasize in order to maintain or escape from our anxiety. Does that make sense? So we know that in relationships now, we live longer than we've ever lived before. And we have a new pattern of commitment, that people used to be married to the same person until they died. And it wasn't that hard because we lived to be about 40. And so when you got bored, you were dead. And now we're expected to live to be 70, 80, sometimes 90 years old. And so living with the same person, particularly without sexual boredom, is more difficult to maintain. So there's a tendency towards multiple partners, either serial partners, serial monogamy, or now multiple partners at the same time, whether that's consensual non-monogamy or non-consensual non-monogamy, like affairs. That's much more common. And we know that from Helen Fisher's studies of the brain, that there's several systems in your brain that are capable of relationship in different ways. And all those systems are connected. That means that you can have a relationship with someone, whether it's long-term or monogamous, but you can also have sex with someone else at the same time. Those two relationships can be connected. They can be to the same person, or they can be to someone separately. So you can have an attached relationship, you can have a caring and nurturing relationship, or you can have a purely sexual relationship. They might all be to the same person. They could be to separate people. They're separate parts of your brain. So the idea that you could have sex with someone without feeling attached is absolutely possible. There's a new study out now with Ashley Madison. Ashley Madison is the website where you cheat with other people that are married. There's 60 million people worldwide on that website now. And with the new Ernst & Young investigation, they found that everyone on there is real. There's no bots on there. And there's the same amount of men as women on the site now. And when they just did a study of 20,000 members, all women, they asked why women were cheating and what they were looking for. And they're looking for sex. And they're looking for good sex. And they don't feel guilty. And so there's something I think that we're missing in our understanding of women and sex. And there's a lot of assumptions about infidelity and about women needing to feel emotional connection in order to have sex, and assumptions that we make that men have sex to feel emotionally connected. I think many times that's true. And I think many times it's the opposite too. And I think many times women can have sex without emotional connection, and that we underestimate women's sexuality. And that sex for pleasure is a common thing among mammals, in female mammals, and among women. And this is not unprecedented. I think that's been that way for a long time. So remember this exercise. What does sex mean to me? What does sex mean to you? What does sex mean to us? The idea of being self-aware, what you know about yourself, what other people know about you, what only you know about yourself, no one else knows, what only other people see about you, and you don't know about yourself, and then what no one knows about you, and you don't know about yourself. These windows, remember this Johari window thing from school? This is interesting when we think about it in terms of sex and sexuality counseling. Because the idea of counseling is to help people to open the window to themselves. To open the window to themselves. If they want to open the window to let a partner in or let other people in, that's their choice. That's their choice. Our job is not to say, you need to open the window and let your partner in to your fantasies, to your internal fantasy life. Your job is not to say you have to share your fantasies with your partner, nor do you even have to share them with me as your therapist. That's not necessary. But your job as a therapist is to help people interpret and explore their fantasies with themselves, to understand their fantasy life and why they are motivated to explore and fantasize about what turns them on, because that gives them the information about what they're anxious about and what they need to heal. That is their route to healing things from their childhood, and it gives them the power to move the locus of control to themselves. That gives them the power to become their own best therapist. Understanding the things that turn you on and why gives you the best self-empowerment that you could have out of therapy, out of counseling. So before we move on, and we're going to do an exercise, I want to do one more thing. How many of you have heard of thinking off? So there's a study with Barry Kamasurak and Nan Weiss at Rutgers University, where they put people in an MRI machine, primarily women. They've tried it with men, and these women in the MRI machine could think themselves to orgasm. And it shows the response in their brain of them actually orgasming, just like the people that are orgasming with a vibrator or with their hand. It's the same actual physiological response. So they are using fantasy to empower their body to have the somatic reaction to bring themselves to orgasm. And so women, particularly women who are super sensitive and super imaginative, can connect their interior visual self to their clitoral response, basically, or to their vaginal response, both. And they're not like superheroes. They're just regular women. So that connection that women have to their bodies is something that gives us information about desire and arousal. And it goes to something that Gina Ogden always talked about. She wrote about women and sex and did a bunch of studies about women and sex around the idea that you can turn yourself off and you can turn yourself on. That you have the power to turn yourself on. It's not the other person who has the power. It's not the other person that's in charge of your arousal and your desire. That you have the power in your mind to turn yourself on, and you know how to turn yourself off. If you right now think about how you turn yourself off from being in the mood for sex. Think about 3 ways. I'm really tired. I ate too much pasta. I feel fat and bloated. I have stuff to do. I have a lot of stuff to do. There's a baby in the room. I mean, you probably know your top 3. I'd rather watch Netflix. I mean, you probably have your hit parade, right? You know what turns you off. You may not be quite as in touch with the 3 things that you do to turn yourself on. I look great. Not about your partner, but about yourself. I look great. I'm really into it. It might be your fantasy world, the things that you think about to turn yourself on. But if you can think about 3 things that you do to push the gas pedal instead of the brakes, those are the tools that you want to help your clients figure out. Can you help them figure out 3 ways that they can turn themselves on? It's easier to help them figure out 3 ways to turn themselves off. But if they can figure that out, they can figure out the other.
What do we know about arousal response being like genetic or inherited or biological? Like you're talking about sort of the power of the mind,
Mm-hmm.
but
there's no connection.
Okay.
Because you can always change your arousal response regardless of what you come in with. You inherit your body. And so if you have, it's like if you have inverted nipples, those are inherited. And so you can change the fact that you have inverted nipples, but you may not change the sensitivity of your nipples, although even that you can change. But you do change, you do inherit, I don't know if inherit is the way you mean it, like in a genetic way.
I'm going to be really candid, but like I'm being really candid. My cousin and I are very close, we're like sisters. We're having a conversation recently about, we're kind of rare amongst our group of friends. It's like super easy for us to orgasm. And we were wondering, like, we didn't know anybody else that we have conversations with our girlfriends and other women about it, and we don't know anybody else that has like almost that problem. And so we were curious, like, just thinking about it, like one of my best friends, for example, she's like really frustrated because no matter what she does, she can't get herself to orgasm with her husband, with herself, whatever. And so, you know, we hear more like when we're talking with other women that seems to be more of the, so we wondered like what part of it is like our mind, what part of it is our body, what part is how we're built, how we're born, like how do you parse that out?
So part of it is anatomical. You know, some women's clitoris is closer to the surface than others. Sometimes it engorges differently than others. You know, some women are just luckier that way than others. Some people have their clitoris deeper embedded into their vulva, and so it's not as sensitive. And sometimes you actually have to have surgery to sort of let it pop out more. Some people have been more sexually interested from a young age and given the freedom to be sexually explorative. Some people have been shamed around masturbation, which is the way that you discover your body and how to orgasm. I mean, you're a sex therapist, so it's clear that you have more interest in the topic. Other people have been more repressed, and so they regress. They have more shame around it in general, around the topic. They can't talk about it, they can't say the word sex. That contributes to it too. So we inherit our things like body image. Like if we'll talk about that when we talk about the eating disorders, but if your mother has a negative body image, you're much more likely to have a negative body image or even an eating disorder. So body issues are inherited, but they're not necessarily genetic. So if your mother had an eating disorder, it doesn't determine that it's not determined that you'll have an eating disorder because it's not necessarily genetic like alcoholism. Although you could have obsessive compulsive issues if your parent had them, which could in fact translate into eating issues or other problems. So it's a myriad of issues, and you just got the bonus for many reasons. Yeah. Well, interestingly, you know, Beverly Whipple, she's the one that with what's his face, his last name starts with a G, coined the term the G spot. And there's a video with RTV, Relationship TV, that where she talks about the G spot and does it exist? Does it not exist? It's a part of your vagina that's about 2 inches up, sort of if you were making a come hither motion, if you were facing me, that feels different than the rest of your vagina, and it has a different texture, and you can only feel it if you're aroused. And if you try to touch it when you're not aroused, it makes you feel like you have to urinate because it's really the back of the urethral sponge. And for some women, they can have G-spot orgasms if they're clitorally stimulated at the same time that their G-spot is stimulated. Other women say they don't have that experience at all, and they wonder if it even exists. So it may be that for some women, they have more G-spot tissue in certain places, and it's closer to the surface, and that they can get more stimulation that way as well. And other women say they've never had that experience, and they have no idea what anyone's talking about. Yeah, and so that's part of her contribution. The other contribution around this is also this idea of fantasy, that women who orgasm easier or more easily have a tendency to be able to use fantasy to connect to their bodies in an easier way. Meredith Chivers is the one that did the study where she hooked up men and women with plethysmographs to measure orgasmic response. She really didn't measure their clitoral response. She measured their vaginal response, and which doesn't really count, I feel like, but she measured male bodies and female bodies. So heterosexual men, heterosexual women, and she put them in front of films of heterosexual couples having sex, lesbians having sex, gay men having sex, and monkeys having sex. And she also showed them pictures of men walking down the beach and people doing yoga, women doing yoga. And she measured their sexual response. The men got turned on by the heterosexual couples having sex and the gay women having sex. The women got turned on by the heterosexual couples having sex, the gay women having sex, the guys walking down the beach, the women doing yoga, and the monkeys having sex. So when we say that only men are visual, everyone says men are so visual. It's not true. Like, women are super visual and interiorly visual. So women who can orgasm better or quicker or more easily tend to be more able to fantasize. So they can use fantasy as a tool. They can turn themselves on and they can connect to their bodies easily. The interesting thing about that study is that they also had a button they could push that determined whether or not they felt turned on. And so the men pushed the button when they saw the straight couples having sex and the gay women having sex. And the women pushed the button when they saw the straight couples having sex and the gay women having sex. So women only determine when they're turned on when they say they're turned on. So women have a very interior visual sense of erotic arousal, but it's determined by their head, not their body. So they're a little bit disconnected from their body. People who orgasm easily may not be as disconnected from their body. They may be more in touch with how that feels and what's going on there. So that's their contribution. So that makes sense what you're saying.
I think it's also important to explore other erogenous zones, because usually when we talk about the female orgasm, it is either from the clitoris or the G-spot.
Mm-hmm.
And I definitely think there's other areas where you can achieve an orgasm that don't happen by your vagina.
Mm-hmm.
But I think some women, I don't know if that's a part of the system that they explore, maybe they haven't thought about it, or maybe that doesn't work.
It's true. It's true. It's true. A lot of what Stephanie Bueller was talking about is that that changes also when you're pregnant or before, during, and after pregnancy. Gina Ogden talks about the multiple erogenous zones on your body. She mapped them out in her study. It's very true. All right, listen, let's take a break. Okay, so let's talk about relationship counseling. When we're talking about sex counseling, we've talked about individual counseling, we've talked about how to integrate sexuality. There's a lot of different kinds of relationship counseling, okay? And we're going to practice some relationship counseling. You probably have some of your own preferences, your own training, your own skill sets, or maybe you're new at this and you want to explore some other types of counseling, but some of you are religious counselors, some of you are scientists, and you're really interested in neuroscience. Some of you might be Gottman trained, or have a background in object relations or attachment, or in mindfulness, which is a more Buddhist background, cognitive behavioral therapy, or things like imago relationship therapy. Why are all these important? Why are they even coming up? Well, this is a quote from a novel by Amy Bloom about Eleanor Franklin. She's talking about the Franklins. Eleanor Franklin had a girlfriend throughout his presidency, but this quote says, every couple has the same 5 arguments in their lifetime, which is really just one over and over, until people die or divorce. What it is depends on who you are and what your parents did to you. Franklin said, love me without criticism or condition. And Eleanor said, be worthy of my love. Or maybe Eleanor said, make life matter. And Franklin said, make life easy. And I think this is a great quote about relationships. Because we all have the same arguments over and over. They might sound different, they might look different, but they are based on our childhood. They're based on the things that we longed for that we didn't get, that we hope our partner will do for us, even though they're trying to get their needs met in the relationship around the things that they didn't get. And we are arguing with each other over and over, banging our heads against the wall, trying to get the things that we long for from someone who is basically totally incapable of giving it to us. And it feels like they're purposely holding out on us because they're looking for something different. So, in other words, love me the way I am. Well, change, and I'll love you the way you are. Why are you still the same person that I married? Why don't you grow? Why can't you love me the way I am, like you said you would when you married me? Make my life matter. Give my life meaning. Well, make it easier for me, and I'll give your life meaning. Those arguments are super common, and they repeat themselves over and over in different ways, in the way they show up. Right now, we have a new dilemma in relationships is robotics. Technology, the way we started off today talking about technology and how it's integrating into relationships. It's now legal in Japan to marry your robot. This robot is marrying them, but there's a whole new level of technology that's being integrated into people's relationships. If you've heard of Gatebox, Gatebox is like Siri or Alexa. It's a little anime person that is virtual reality, kind of artificial intelligence. She's a little person that sits in a little glass cylinder and wakes up when you get home. But she's connected to all of your devices. So she knows how to turn on your lights. She knows how to order food for dinner. She knows your calendar. She knows what you're watching on television. And she talks to you. She's a little person. And she also comes out of the box and she's projected into the room. And in Japan, there's more single men than there are women. And they live in very small apartments because space is tight, and they really work a lot of hours. So this is a dilemma in countries where companionship is an issue, and loneliness is at an all-time high, not just in Japan, but in many countries. Sorry, my contact messed up. And so we have a problem now with sex robots, too, in this country and in other countries. China developed a series of sex robots that are now coming to America. You can buy a sex robot for about $20,000 with a replaceable vagina. You can put it in the dishwasher. They don't have a lot of male sex robots because there's not really a market for it. But that is going to infiltrate your experience as a therapist. And more therapy is moving online. You can do therapy over Twitter. You can do therapy on text. You can do therapy, virtually. I do it on Skype all the time for people around the world. And so, or coaching. And so you can do this integratively, or you can fight the machine, so to speak, and resist it. But it's part of people's lives. And when a robot has all of your preferences in its brain and knows all about you, the only thing that keeps it from feeling like a true relationship with another person is its capacity for empathy. And so the way that they try to program in empathy is to anticipate response. And the way that they anticipate response is to program in eye movement. And so when you think about empathy, and you think about empathy in a relationship or in a sexual counseling relationship or in any kind of therapeutic relationship, empathy is built into your eye movement. Which is interesting for me, having just moved to Santa Monica, California, where everyone has plastic surgery. No one can move their forehead. So I find that interesting. I'm very tempted to get it, but then I think about my capacity to move my face. And so, with all due respect to my California buds, I think that the anticipatory empathy, the capacity to look a few seconds into the future around what the client or the couple is saying or what your partner is saying, is part of what makes people feel connected. Now, robots are programmed to be able to do this, but what happens is, and Brian Nicole talks about this, what happens is the technology is not up to speed. So sometimes the robot's eyes go like this. And so the technology of people not making eye contact, or worse, zoning out, makes it feel not just disconnected, but abandoned. And it feels aggressive. So yeah, it's very interesting, actually. So we have some really good couples counseling methods. I do imago therapy because it's a relational dialogue, and that's what I'm going to teach you today, just a brief way of dialoguing. Gottman does conflict resolution, basically. EFT is emotionally focused therapy. It's really around attachment, early attachment and bonding. PACT is Stan Tatkin. He does neurology and attachments. He talks about the brain and attachment. Ellen Bader and her husband, Pearson, they do a developmental model, so developmental stages of a relationship. And Heidi Schleifer does encounter-centered therapy. She was in imago therapy. Now she talks about the bridge in between. Sort of like the space that we started off talking about. What do you put into the space? This is the Gottman house. It's like a sound relationship house. So you build love maps. In other words, you know each other's world. You share fondness and admiration. You turn towards one another instead of away. You have a positive perspective. You learn to manage your conflict. You accept your partner's influence in your life. You dialogue about your problems. You practice self-soothing. You make your life dreams come true, and then you create shared meaning. The basic goal around Gottman, which I think is so wonderful, is the contribution of his research, of their research, was to let everyone know that everyone has conflict. Conflict is inevitable in your relationship. It is not going to determine whether or not your relationship is going to be successful. It has absolutely nothing to do with it. If you fight, you're totally normal, remember. What does determine the success of your relationship is how you handle your conflict, how you make up. And that will determine the success and the future of your relationship. And that is their contribution. Attachment is interesting because attachment is an early phase of development. It happens through infancy, through rapprochement, and it determines safety between a parent and a child, or an object and a child. And it's meant to create safety for family so that young children and infants can develop bonds. And those early bonds create a jumping off place to go into the world. Okay? So if you have a safe space and you can go off into the world and then come back and check in to that bonded place, then you feel securely attached. If when you come back, that parent is anxious or alcoholic or in their own drama or not available, then you become insecurely attached because there's no secure object. If there's no one there, then you might be anxious because there's nothing to attach to. If that object is abusive, then you might become insecure and avoidant. If there is an object that gathers you and holds you and tells you not to go anywhere because you have to come home and stay close and take care of me because I need you, or because the world out there is dangerous, you may also become very fearfully avoidant. And so all of those bonding lessons that you learned early on stay with you for the rest of your life. You can't escape them. You can change depending on who you end up in a relationship with, because the things that you long for, you can heal depending on your partner. But it will affect the way that you have sex. However, when we talk about sex, we're not really talking about attachment. We're talking about separation and individuation. That's a later stage development. That's adolescence. You start thinking about sex in adolescence. You become a sexual person later on when you break away from your parents, when you're not in the familial bond. You're actually doing the opposite. You're breaking away from your family. Sex is not about family and safety, because the moment you parentify your relationship with your partner is the moment you stop wanting to have sex. So the dilemma and the challenge is to not objectify your partner as a parent, but to separate and individuate as a whole adult person in an equal partnership, where they're not acting like your father, you're not acting like their mother, and you don't have that bossy relationship, or you don't have that condescending or critical relationship that mirrors your parents. And so we do see some motivation around anxious attachments having decreased sexual motivation, or physical pleasure is positive because it's healing their anxiety. I want to have sex because it makes me feel close and decreases my anxiety that you're going to always be there for me. And if I can give you good sex, then you'll never leave me. That's a sign of anxious attachment. Avoidant attachment are people that are afraid of emotional closeness. They use sex to manipulate. Like, if I'm not really into monogamy, I'm afraid of commitment, but if I have sex with you, I can get something I want out of you, but I can't be intimate and emotional with you. And so there are studies around sex and attachment, and how avoidantly attached people or fearfully attached people have sexual relationships. But your goal in sex counseling is to get people out of their attached stories and into their adult selves. I think that imago therapy does that through dialogue, because it's no longer you as the rescuer and then the victim and the perpetrator in the room. It's you as a witness to the two of them. And that they can be the giver and the receiver, and you can be the witness. So you get out of that trauma triangle of the victim, perpetrator, and rescuer. So they can do the work. So the idea is for you to get them to dialogue with one another about their sexuality and about what they want. And we'll talk to you about how to do that. Now, Stan Tatkin, who does neurology and attachment, he talks about creating a couple bubble. And that being in a relationship is about keeping each other safe and secure. So he says, when you're in distress, I will believe you no matter what. Even if it's uncomfortable for me, if you're in distress, I'm going to believe you. That's a commitment that I make to keep our couple bubble whole. I'll never leave you. That's my commitment to you. That seems rather grandiose, but the way that I can integrate that into my work is to say, I'm committed to you today. Monogamy is difficult. If I make that choice, I'm making it today. Some days are harder than others, but today I'm going for it. And that doesn't mean that I'm not committed to our monogamy agreement, but it's a recognition that some days are harder than others, and we are committed to the whole vision. Because you don't commit necessarily to the other person, you commit to the agreement. Because the other person will always let you down. But if you commit to the vision of the agreement, then you can modify the agreement. You can't modify the other person. You can't change another person, but you can change the agreement. And so his commitment is, I will never frighten you intentionally. I like that. That's good. I think that's pretty reasonable. Even if I'm the one who's causing you distress, this is attached to this. If you're in distress, I'll believe you, even if I'm the one causing you distress. So when you say you're upset, or when you say you're upset with me, I honor that. I don't try to talk you out of it. I don't try to say that's not true. I don't try to say you shouldn't feel that way. I don't try to say you're making that up. I believe you. Our relationship is more important than my need to be right. That's a hard one for most people. Bless you. And you'll be the first to hear about anything. That's an interesting one, because the betrayal for a lot of people is when they hear from other people, oh, I hear you guys are having trouble. I hear your husband had an affair. No, I hear that you guys are, what happened the other day in one of my sessions is somebody's wife told one of her friends that they were in financial trouble. And this is a couple that had made a ton of money. He was in advertising, made a bunch of money over the years, and now they are considering going into bankruptcy. But he didn't want to tell anyone. He's never told anyone, and she's telling all her friends. And it came back to him. Somebody said, oh, I heard you're having financial trouble. And he was like, who are you telling? Like, what are you doing? Like, that's my whole ego. My definition of who I am as a person is tied up into how much money I make. And Facebook, that's a perfect example. Facebook.
That's right.
Right. So your whole life is on Facebook, and things your partner doesn't know they're on Facebook. Yeah, exactly. Or it's like finding out that your status has changed and your relationship. Somebody said, I just read this somewhere. Someone said they found out that they were broken up with on Facebook. Yeah. It happens a lot. Their status was changed. Nice. Yeah. The world is changing. This is Dan Siegel. So he does neuroscience, and he talks about the senses, and this is his hub. The hub represents the experience of awareness, knowing, while the rim contains all the points of anything we could become aware of, that which is known to us. We can send a spoke out to the rim to focus our attention on one point or another on the rim. So this is who we are, our perception, but then we can send out our awareness to be interconnected with other people. We can send out our awareness to our mental activities, to our body, to our senses. So basically he says, we are who we are, but we can connect to other people, or to our bodies, or to ourselves. Object relations theory was Winnicott. He died, I think, in the 70s. This is an old theory, but this was the foundation for attachment. It's the foundation for psychotherapy, basically. It was kind of after Freud. And integrated psychoanalytic theory, Freud didn't really have any research. Winnicott watched little kids, and it's not like the Erikson stages of development. It's basically about behavior and relationships. And it's based on 4 to 6 months of your life, and then we internalize all those feelings, and then we develop relationships between the mother as a prototype for forever. So it's interesting because they really talked a lot about the breast as the symbol. And why? Because that's usually what feeds you. And we know this to be true because of all the symbols of a circle in our lives. If you look at rose windows in churches, circle mandalas, the circle is also a symbol for the breast. And that the circle is a symbol of nurturing, and that we always go back to this circle symbol, and it's just part of our culture. And that it also represents that earliest figure, that earliest memory, or earliest realization of connection and bonding. And it's so transformational because it's part of our formation as people. And we use it in transference later on. As an art therapist, I was an art therapist for a long time, and we would make people draw mandalas, which is just a round circle, and fill it in. And it's a projective technique. You can find out a lot about people in that. When I do another module for this series that I'm doing, we're going to talk more about art therapy and integration. The other thing I think is important about Winnicott is that the good enough mother becomes the presence that the kid internalizes, which means the mother doesn't have to be perfect. You can screw up your kid a little bit. You just have to be a good enough mother. Every one of you in here had a good enough mother because you're here. And you had a good enough basis for being able to survive in the world and do as well as you have. You're as successful as you are because you had good enough nurturing. You had good enough object relations to be here. And so you are good at internalizing images and the relationship to them. Mindfulness now, I think, is the integration of our understanding of spirituality and Eastern religions, which is now, in many cases, part of our psychotherapy and our understanding of psychotherapy. How many of you do mindfulness or relaxation or guided imagery so it's become part of our language, right? Mindfulness-based stress reduction, there's a lot of research now. And we use it in all kinds of alternative therapies. But one of the things that I think holds the space really, really well for couples therapy is the dialogue skill. And I think the dialogue skill, the skill of reflection was not created by imago therapy, which is developed by Harville Hendricks in the book, Getting the Love You Want. But it was created probably from the beginning of time when a mother looked at their child and mirrored back what they saw, right? So that early object relations, that early attachment is a mirror for what the child sees. When you mirror back to your partner what they say, it is neurologically similar and can heal some of those neurological pathways from early infancy. It's also the same distance that you hold a baby is the same distance usually when you have intercourse with someone, same distance away. Your facial expression sometimes mirrors and mimics that. And so the healing properties of dialogue reinforce attachment, reinforce object relations, and so does sex. And so having a dialogue about sex heals you in a lot of ways. So I like using the dialogue to talk about sexual issues. I think it's very helpful. So the basic 3 parts of imago dialogue are mirroring, validating, and empathizing. Mirroring simply means saying back what the other person said about you or said to you. Right? You're an imago therapist. So and you're an imago therapist. So if I say to you, I'm really glad you came here today, you would simply say back to me, so you're really glad I came here today. And that simple mirroring technique, once people get it early on in the sessions, can be used later on when people are saying much more intense things that might be painful, because it helps people hold the space of difficult conversation. And it's a skill set that they can take home, and they don't have to be dependent on you as the counselor. It's something that works as that object they can take home with them, like the rock that they took from my office. And so it becomes a skill that when they're in conflict at home, they can say, wait, let me see if I got that. And they can mirror back something so that they let their partner know they're hearing them. They don't have to make a decision. They don't have to agree. They don't have to disagree. They don't make any promises. They just have to mirror so that their partner feels heard and listened to. The next part is validation. It makes sense that you feel that way. Knowing you the way I know you, I totally get that you feel that way, that you're thinking that you're feeling that you're going there, that you want to leave, that you want to stay, that you want to have the baby, that you don't want to have the baby, that you're mad at me, that you don't want to have sex, that you have that fantasy. Sexual empathy is purely using this skill to talk about fantasy. And then the third part is empathy. Empathy, the thing that we are so missing right now in this country. Purely the capacity to say, I imagine you feel. Put yourself in someone else's shoes and to be emotionally connected to them. I imagine you feel. And then guessing at what that person might be feeling, and then checking in, is that how you feel? Those 3 skills can change someone's life. And if you can give them those skills, practicing those skills in your office and then give them those skills to take home, it really makes your life easier because now you can be the witness to them as they give and receive in this dialogue, and you don't have to do all the work. And they can take it home, right? So in the work that you do in counseling, the way that we do sex counseling or sex therapy, remember, we're not focusing on the problem. We're focusing on a solution. And we're starting off always with appreciation, because when you start with appreciation, it opens that prefrontal cortex. You're not starting off with, we have to talk. You and I, we got a problem, and I need to speak to you. That's parental. You're in trouble, okay? Once you're parentifying, you're desexualizing, and you're not creating safety within that dyad, within the couple. But if you start with appreciation, you know what I really appreciate about you? That you came today. So you appreciate that I'm here today, that I came. Now I can open up to the conversation without going into my brain stem, which is saying, get the hell out of here. We're about to have a fight. I don't want to be here. And all my defenses go up that block this conversation. But if we're starting with appreciation, I can hear what you want to say. I'm open. Tell me more. What else do you appreciate about me? What else you got? Bring in more. If somebody gives you an appreciation, all you have to say is, thank you, and is there more? Not, this old thing, I got this on sale. That's it. People don't know how to take compliments and appreciation. They kind of suck at it, especially women. Really bad at it. So the next part, this is a dialogue about a vision for the future. One thing I dream about for our future, one way I might get in the way of this dream, that's taking on the locus of control so that the therapist doesn't do it, the partner does it. What I'm willing to do to create this dream, again, giving responsibility to the partner. One way I can ask you for help so that the responsibility goes between the partners, not to the therapist. Sharing with this vision with you now, I feel, and one thing I appreciate about this dialogue. So I'd like you to break up into threes. One person's going to be the therapist, and one person is going to be the receiver, and one person is going to be the sender. And as the therapist, you're going to help guide them to mirror each other through these sentence stems. And then at the end, you're going to have them validate and empathize. Now, we have two Imago therapists in the room. Can you raise your hand? Anybody else done Imago therapy? So you might want to, consult with them if you like. They can start you off, or partner with them. How many people do we have? 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 9 or 10? 9. Okay, good. 3 threesomes. And you're going to switch around. So you want to mirror, and then at the end of that, of those sentence stems, validate, empathize, and then switch. All right? And your therapist is there to help guide you through the process, particularly to help you if you tend to go off into like a tangent, like, well, one thing I dream about for our future is that we're going to live in this giant mansion in Malibu. And when the other person goes, no, we're never doing that. Are you kidding? Like, you just say, all you have to do is mirror. Just stay with it. If you get reactive or things come up for you, just hold that. And we can talk about that later, about how that feels. Like, you really just want to stay in that space and practice that mirror and validating and empathizing. All right, any questions?
What happens after you empathize her?
You go home.
Your problems are solved.
Now, normally you would talk about, so this is what came up for me, and this is how this made me feel. And you would sort of switch and go deeper into the feelings. Today we're just going to practice this part. So on the podcast, too, I have an interview with Wednesday Martin, who wrote Untrue, Why Nearly Everything You Believe About Women and Lust and Infidelity is Untrue. And so you might want to check her out. She's got her own podcast now and videos. And it really debunks a lot of what we know about sexuality and the history of sexuality. And that a lot of our understanding of female reproduction and mating comes from a fruit fly study that was done in the 40s. So the idea that men mate to spread their seed and women mate to like stay home is not true. It was based on fruit flies, and it was never reproduced after the 40s, and it doesn't apply to mammals. And so she gathers a bunch of more sociologically and anthropologically relevant research to talk about how women have always been more sexologically driven, and that women really drive the species forward. It's not men. And she has a lot of research to back that up and much more reasonable theories about why that is. And so when we talk about the dialogue and what you guys are talking about, the reason I give you a dialogue about a vision for the future is because I like to focus on dialogues that are about what would happen if. Because they trigger that fantasy part of the brain. They trigger the creative part of your brain. Right now, we're at a point in history where so much is given to us. Like every free moment of your life you spend on the phone. Like you have to wait for the subway for 5 minutes, so you're on your phone. There's no room for creative thought to bubble forward. Everything is already pre-programmed into your life. And so the idea of problem solving around your relationship agreement is almost getting lazy. It's like this idea of like, give this to me, do this for me. There's an expectation that your relationship should just come easy. Like I told you I loved you when I married you. Well, I'll let you know if I change my mind. We made a monogamy agreement when we got married, and so that should last the rest of our lives. Instead of re-upping all the time and renewing our relationship agreement so that it follows the process of a normal relationship development, which changes as we age, and it changes as we grow, and it changes as our children grow, and it changes throughout our lifetime. That puts the responsibility on the couple to maintain the relationship agreement, just like you have to maintain your house, just like you have to maintain your health. You have to maintain the health of your relationship agreement. It's the house, it's the space in between you. It's the structure within which you survive. If you don't talk about it and you don't maintain that and continue to put energy into it, it does dissipate and it falls apart and people get betrayed. And it's the people that are in your life also that are affected by that. So your life has less to do with you and more to do with those who cross your path. We talked about that a little bit when we talk about social isolation. How does your relationship create a structure or container for the people around you? So if you're around a relationship that has a lot of eros energy and passion and aliveness, it feeds people around you. If you're around a conflictual relationship, it drains you. And so what do you put into the space in your relationship so that it can expand to other people around you as well, so that it can affect people in your life? What was it like to do this couples therapy session? What did you notice?
In the mirroring, I found as the one who was supposed to mirror, sometimes I would get ahead of myself. And so if I didn't kind of parrot what she was saying, then I was getting defensive.
Oh, interesting. So when you didn't mirror, you would get defensive.
Yeah, I would be like, oh, so you're saying I don't compromise? Is what I wanted to say. I did not say that. But that's what crossed my mind when it came up. You know, I appreciate that, you know, you compromise. I'm thinking, what? We don't compromise? So it was interesting to, you know, and I don't know her from a hill of beans, so it was kind of interesting to have that come up, like, from nowhere.
Yeah, so you kept your reactivity in check by mirroring, but you could feel it, even the transfers to another person that you don't even know in that role play. Yeah, makes sense.
That was pretty interesting.
That's pretty interesting, yeah.
So is there room in Imago to process that? How was it when you were mirroring your partner? There is, okay.
Yeah.
Doesn't just stick with that.
And that's why I like to have long sessions so you have
Yeah.
room to talk about things. You know, you can't do couples counseling in 45 minutes.
No.
You just can't.
How long are your sessions?
I like to do at least an hour and a half.
Okay.
Sometimes I just get an hour. But my total preference is to do a day. Like I like to do intensives and just have them for a day.
That's great.
Because you can just unpack everything and then heal everything and then send them on their way. Another successful session.
Healed.
Yeah, and you really get a lot done because when you see someone an hour a week, you sort of rip off the Band-Aid and send them off and hope that they make it to the following week. You know, like it's a lot of work to maintain that relationship agreement and that practices. That's why you give them the skills and the tools to do it. How's it for you guys?
Well, just for me, that's my specialty.
Another day at work.
Yeah, I think we had a good conversation though. Just talking, just a refresher course. But I would be more interested to hear what Colleen has to say.
My voice is really shut.
We won't make you talk.
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay, we'll give you a break. What about for you guys?
It really allowed me clarity into how she was feeling, so I didn't really have to sit there thinking like, I wonder what she's feeling, or I wonder, am I interpreting this wrong? Because she gave it to me, and then having to reflect it back, that gave me care, like, okay, am I understanding you correctly, so I'm not misinterpreting what you're saying to me. So it really put me into the other person's shoes.
Good.
I think for me, I was telling them, like, I'm a thinker, so when I hear her say, like, for example, we need to compromise, I'm already thinking, like, why are you saying that? What does that mean? Blah, blah, blah. Instead of trying to mirror you and just be present in the moment. So it was good practice for me to be in the moment and just listen instead of letting my head take over.
Yeah, to be really present.
Right.
Yeah, and centered. Yeah, I like that. Love a motto, she said.
I will say it was interesting. I didn't want to be the therapist, but I was the patient. And it was nice. It just reaffirms for me, like, first of all, how important hearing is. Again, just hearing what everyone else is saying is what I tell my clients when I open the session is you can't think about a retort when you're mirroring someone, because a lot of the times with couples, they're always thinking about what they're going to say back. It completely forces you to be in the present and really hear your partner. And there's something, and as we were talking about, we just don't do that enough in the world. And telling Colleen, I use Imago in all my relationships, not just mirroring, but the validation component is just, in Imago we say, when you validate someone, it's not agreement. And that's the one thing it's that you make sense. And so there's a difference between, it's not enabling or condoning or agreeing, but it's that you found something in the other person that makes sense. And every human being wants to be validated, whether it's a child, whether it's adult. And I've just taken those concepts and just applied them everywhere in my life. And I'm so grateful for having that training.
Nice.
I did reflect on that as being the patient, that I got to do that.
Yeah.
I don't get to do that much.
Yeah. It's nice to be the patient.
Yeah, I know.
I
need to go back
This
there.
is so healing.
I have an observation about it. Sometimes it's hard to find like a skill set to help someone who doesn't naturally come to empathy, who doesn't understand. What do you mean? I don't feel. I'm not feeling it or whatever. This is a scientific method that shows a person who is not predisposed to that how they can get to that place of showing empathy and experiencing what it's like in someone else's shoes. That if you're a brainy person or someone who's not aware of emotions, maybe spectrum folks or whatever is going on. It's such a great way to access that. It's a really good tool.
Yeah, and you don't have to be perfect at it. You can guess. Is that what you're feeling? I'm wondering if you're feeling that. And your point, that's a good point. And really, I feel like the goal is that we are in a relationship to foster each other's spiritual growth. To build on each other's challenges to help each other grow to be the people that we're supposed to be in the world, not to get someone to agree with us, although that would be nice, but to get someone to the place that they're meant to be or that they have the capacity to be. And that is what I call transformational marriage, or transformational relationships. And that's much different than just a non-confrontational relationship. And so in that way, you're not marrying for transactional reasons, like so that we can pass down our inheritance to our children or so that we can get a certain amount of sex from each other. It's really for expansion. And so that we can both transform as a result of it. And that's a new kind of relationship. People weren't doing that 100 years ago. I think that what we are not good at, what we mentioned before, is the ending part. Like, it doesn't mean you have to stay with someone forever, because that, first of all, if we're going to be successful at this, we have to recognize that people aren't staying together forever. So if you only judge yourself as a successful counselor or therapist by the people that stay together, you're going to fail half the time. So how can you look at success in your sessions differently? And perhaps your job is also to help people transition through change, through endings in a healthier way, so that they're not hurting each other. So they're having a more conscious, intentional divorce, so that they're transitioning into death, so that they're having endings that are not so dramatically painful and devastating to families, to themselves, to the planet. It's not just bam and go. It's not just destroy and destruct. Because what we have now is a model where you destroy everything in your path and move on. And that's not, pivot. Pivot is say thank you, appreciate what you've learned, and then pivot to the next thing. And there's a growth model in that. So in this model, you're creating an ideal relationship vision. And I think that's why that's important to begin to think about what that's going to look like. Even if it looks like an open relationship. On Saturday, we're going to talk about monogamy agreements and even how that could go wrong and how to manage that. The people that usually work well in open relationships are curious, they communicate well, and they're committed to the agreement. Doesn't mean they're more or less committed to another person. And I think in ending, I want to show you a quick video, and then I'll let you out a few minutes early. Okay? I want to say thank you here because I'm going to end the video, and thank you guys for a great day.